So welcome, this is Unit 8. We are talking about photography. So just to remind you, if you haven't watched the art historical videos for Unit 8, that's the videos going from um, starting at the Age of Enlightenment or the end of the Age of Enlightenment, going through Romanticism and ending just around the beginning of Realism. And so in this unit we're covering photography as the one art medium that we're discussing. And so this photography lecture is a little bit long, so it may go to four parts. But most of the length is kind of at the beginning. There's a lot of info that I want to cover right at the beginning of the lecture, and then most of the rest of the length is less having to do with what I say, but just that there are a whole lot of artists I'd like to show you. And right off the bat, I'd like to apologize for the fact that both that I'm showing you so many different photographers. Um, Unlike other fields, photography is only 150, 200 years old, so it's a lot harder to edit down and figure out who are just the few um, artists to show you in the field. So therefore, I think I'm looking at a lot more. But at the same time, I also apologize for the fact that I couldn't show you more, because I still feel like, especially with the contemporary photographers, there are tons of contemporary photographers that I admire and I think are really important that I just can't fit into this lecture, so keep that in mind. So some of the main stuff that we need to cover to begin with is the beginnings of photography involve people figuring out the basic ability to combine a camera obscura with a photographic plate. So a camera obscura, if you remember from previous lectures, is like when we were talking about Caravaggio. A camera obscura is basically a dark room with a very, very tiny hole on one side. If you get a room, it doesn't have to be a super big room, but a room that a person could be in, and then you put a pin-sized hole on one side of the room and a blank wall on the other, and then you have on the outside of that room a lot of light. The light coming from the outside will go through that tiny hole, and the hole will act sort of like a lens. It will refract the light, and then you'll get a projection of the stuff on the other side of the room, the outside, the next room over, or the outside of the building, whatever, and that will be projected on the back of the wall, upside down. And this is the basic, point of how our eyes work, and this is the basic way that a camera works. So to make a camera something that someone could hold in their hand to take pictures, you have to take this idea, you have to shrink the room down to a reasonable size. No longer is it something that someone could walk in, but then you need to, since the room's small, you no longer have an artist inside who can reproduce the image on the other side of the wall. So what you need is some sort of photographic plate, some light sensitive material that will, when light hits it, it will go light and dark and make a recreation of that image, of that exposure. Okay, so once you have that beginning, and if you then also add to that lenses, and you can control sharpness, focus better, then you have the beginnings of being able to have a working camera. And then the next thing that people were really working on as they were trying to control exposure was control, how much light comes in, because if you get too much light on that photographic plate, it just washes out the image, and you don't get anything at all. It doesn't look like you saw anything. It's just all white. And if you get too little light, it's just dark. You barely see just a shadow image of possibly what you shot. You have to get just the right amount of light, and that's called exposure. And so there are two main ways that you can control that. One is how long are you going to be exposing that back plate, right? So how long do you basically open that window? And then the other is how tiny is that hole, right? If you remember back with the camera obscura, the hole was very, very tiny, and that's it. You didn't have an ability to change the size. But with a handheld camera, there are different kinds of ways of changing the size of that hole to thereby increase the light. Now, one of the things also is that if you go with a really large hole, then you're no longer letting the refraction is not going to help you very much in terms of sharpening the focus on the image. So that's another reason why you need lenses. So that if you're going to have a camera where you're going to have multiple different sizes of aperture, then you're also going to need lenses so that the lenses can do the job of creating focus. And then the last major development that really was important was the development of photographic film. So if you have film where you can make negatives from that film, right, as opposed to having a photographic plate, then with that film you can use that to, A, you can make your camera smaller, but also B, you can use that film to then reproduce that photograph onto a paper, and you can have copies of photographs, right? The original photographs were only one of a kind. All right. So that's some of the main stuff. We'll talk about depth of field a little bit later on, so we can cover some of the rest of this through the lecture. So the very beginning of photography begins with this rivalry between two different processes, a daguerreotype and a calotype. And there's not much, and the talbotype is just another variation on a calotype. There's not, it would be too complicated to explain the chemical processes, but keep in mind there's just two competing systems, but they both involve photographing on a plate, and but then eventually we start having photographic film and people photographing, being able to make photographic prints on paper. So here I want to talk about some of the early experimenters in photography, Steichen and Stieglitz. And I apologize for those of you who might notice that there is kind of an American bias to a lot of this, but I had to keep my limits somewhere. So, and Steichen and Stieglitz are taking slightly different points of view about the beginnings of photography. Obviously, Steichen has a kind of a more romantic kind of goal or intent with his images. They tend to have a very moody sort of side. And Stieglitz is beginning to think more of photography as being about documentation, about a tool that can help us see those things that we often ignore. And that will lead also to eventually thinking about social documentation. That leads to Louis Hine. Louis Hine is one of my favorite photographers, and he was a photographer at the beginning of the 20th century, and he came to photography primarily through his interest in social issues, most notably in workers' rights, and especially like children's rights. You know, this is the period before child labor laws, where children as young as 5 or 7 might be working in factories. And he documented things like that, and it was through the work of people like Louis Hine and writers and other artists that these things became well known, and also then that laws were passed to change that, so we no longer had 6-year-olds working in mines in Kentucky or West Virginia. Another artist or another photographer who also was very much interested in the documentary aspect of photography is Robert Capa, and he's especially well known for his war documentation, especially this image from the Spanish Civil War. And so there's a couple of themes I'm going to be talking about as we go through this lecture, and one of them is that the documentation theme. Photography is a very new medium, so in this first century, 2 centuries of using it, people have had a lot of different kind of ideas of what's the primary purpose of photography, and being able to document life, being able to show us things as they really are, has definitely been one of the things that artists thought that's the real role, the purpose of photography. Okay, I'm going to end part 1 right there. I'll